Well, good afternoon and welcome to this estate planning webinar. I'm Russ Crosson. I'm the Chief Mission Officer at Ronald Blue Trust. I'm entering my 44th year, or just finishing my 43rd year of being involved in this business, and just look forward to sharing with you this afternoon some principles and some wisdom that we've learned over the years in helping folks deal with their estate. Now, you may be seeing the word estate planning and think this is going to be technical. I'm not going to get into techniques. I'm going to get into why, when, where, and what relative to estate planning. So I'm hopefully going to give you a little different perspective about your estate planning. So we're going to work with this diagram this afternoon. So thanks for joining us. If you have any questions while we're going through, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll have a Q&A at the end, and we can interact then, but you can also put them in the chat as we go along if you have questions. Also, you can go to ronblue.com if you have further questions about anything I say this afternoon. But hopefully what you're going to hear is maybe a different perspective on how to look at your estate planning. Most people start with techniques. That's down in box 5 you'll see on this diagram. Most people start, they go to their attorney, they deal with techniques, but that's not where you start in your estate planning process. And I would just have you write that word down, estate planning process. It's a process. And unfortunately, the more you have, the more the process is interactive and ongoing because your situation changes, your children change, and so you have to continually be reviewing what you currently have as far as your estate plan. Fact is, like I said, I've done this for over 4 decades, and we find that many people have a stack of documents this thick with an executive summary on top, and they still don't know what it means. So one of the things we do at Ronald Blue Trust is we take all of that information and put it in picture form so you know exactly what you have and where it's going and when and what it's going to look like. And we'll talk some more about that as we go along, but it's important to take those documents and look at them in a graphic format and a flowchart format to see exactly what's happening in your estate. You'll notice at the top of this sheet there's a verse, Ecclesiastes 7, 11, and 12, and that's a great verse on estate planning. It says you can leave your children wisdom and you can leave them money, and they'll both protect, but only one preserves, and that's the issue of wisdom. So if you're going to err in your estate planning decisions, you err on the side of leaving wisdom to your children, not just money. So let's start and unpack this diagram and our time here together. So we're going to start with the first question you have to ask yourself, and that's how much to my children and my heirs and how much to charity? And I have many people say, well, Russ, I don't know how to answer that. How do I answer how much to charity and how much to my heirs? I don't even know where to start with that. Well, I'll give you a principle here in a minute about a way to start, but let me just start first of all by saying you all have an answer. If you have that stack of documents, like I just said, if you have wills and trust and you've already done some estate planning, which hopefully you have wills. By the way, if you don't have your own wills, the state has a distribution plan for you and you probably won't like what your state has. So make sure that you've got your documents. So let's say you have those documents. You have answered this question. Those documents have an answer for this question. What I have found is that many people don't know the answer. They've never really looked at it and factored in the increased value of the business, or they factored in their life insurance. They just really don't know what the number is. And so it's important that your documents have answered this question. It's important for you to know, well, how much is going to my heirs? And what I've experienced is very few people have ever had charity in their documents to start with. Now let me talk a little bit about this. The government will allow you now to leave about 26 million, 13 million for each of you that you can leave tax-free to your heirs. So what many times people will do in the answer to this question, how much to charity and how much to heirs, is they'll say, leave my children, all I can leave them tax-free. Now I'm not saying you should do that. You need to pick a number and it may not be that much. But one way to make sure you don't pay any estate tax is very simply put in your documents, leave my children anything I can leave them tax-free, everything else goes to charity. Charity becomes another beneficiary in your estate documents. Now the laws are going to change if they don't change them in 2026, so a little over 2 years, and they're going to drop that number back from 26 million between husband and wife to 15 million. And so that's going to be a moving target. It has been moving for multiple years here. It started off at 600,000 each, if you can believe that, 1.2 million years ago, and it's moved its way up to 26 million. But the point is, you have an answer to that question. You need to know, do I like the answer, and what is that number? Because based on your net worth, you have an answer. But make sure you factor in insurance and fair market value of assets. Now let me give you a principle when you're trying to answer this question. Usually, when your children are between 0 and 20, you err on less rather than more. Because what's the worst thing that can happen to your kids if they don't get a lot of money? They have to learn to work and build social capital and spiritual capital and build character qualities like you had to build. So if you're going to err, answering that question less rather than more when they're younger. And then as they move from age 20 to age 40, and these are just broad brackets, then you could, as they're watching, as they're getting established in their business or starting their careers, whatever, you might be able to leave them more. And then what I've observed is usually if they've already kind of made it and they're over 40, it really doesn't matter what you leave them. But I think you need to be very careful when they're younger to potentially have an unintended consequence of undermining their work ethic. So make sure you answer the question, what do I really want to have happen here? I had a guy who had a business, and we carried the business at $4 million on his net worth, and he had two daughters that were like 16 and 18, and so $2 million, they can get a house, they can start a business, it's probably not going to ruin them, but he got an offer for $100 million for his business. He owned 40% of it. The number is really $40 million, and now that number is $20 million for each daughter. That's probably not a good number, so he has to go back in and change his documents and reduce it down to something that, based on their age and where they are in their growth, spiritually and fiscally and everything, that he would leave a lesser amount. So first thing you have to decide is how much to children, how much to charity. And like I said, you have an answer. Make sure you know what your number is. If you don't like the answer, then change your documents like that guy had to do. He had to go back in and reduce it. He couldn't just say, leave them, 50% of my estate each, because that was too big of a number for the ages they were, and had to go back and reduce that. So once you've answered that question, the second question people ask is, do I leave it equally to each heir? Well, here's the principle here. If you're not going to leave it equally, which is what's going to be expected by your children because they're going to look at that as your degree of love for them, then you need to explain it while you're alive. We'll talk about communication here in a little bit, but typically it's done equally. I'm not saying you can't leave it unequal, and people will say, this is where the whole stewardship thing comes in, and people say, well, Russ, I've got one child that's walking with God, another one's not, he's wayward. Well, I would just say to all of us, where were we when God intercepted us? We were not lovely, we were on a wrong track, and God intercepted us. And so the issue of you judging your children and saying, okay, I'm going to give these that are tracking a different amount than the one that's not tracking because I got to be a good steward, I think you got to be real careful with that. Fact is, what do you want that wayward child to hear when they read the wills? That they were disowned, that they didn't get the same amount as their siblings? And this may be your last opportunity to show love for them. And God showed love for us when we were unlovely. My experience has been that typically you will leave your assets equally. I'm not saying you can't leave them unequal, but in most cases it should be done equally. And I think there's some unintended consequences if you do it unequally, but if you do it, you just have to talk about it on the front end. So that's the answer to that question. Usually it's equal. I like to sometimes add that you leave it to them equally at the level the least mature one can handle. You say, well, that's not fair. I've got some that are really fiscally responsible and some that aren't. That's why you want to go back to the life overview and be in the process of teaching your children social and spiritual capital, building that into them in addition to financial capital. And by the way, let me just pause there for a minute and say that that's really what this is all about. You want to not let your money and how you leave it undermine your children building spiritual and social capital. That's why, what's the worst thing that happens? Your children have they don't have big trust funds. They have to learn to work. They have to learn to have faith in God. Psalm 78, 5-7 is a neat passage because it says he commanded our fathers to teach their children, to teach their children, to teach their children. So 4 generations in those 3 verses to put their confidence in God, not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. So my observation is that if you're going to err on less rather than more. Usually you leave it equal. And because what you're after is your children learning to trust God, build a work ethic which gives them great social capital characteristics, and that's what you're after. And you don't want to inadvertently undermine that in your children. So know the number, see if you like the number, base the number kind of on their age, where they are in their life journey, and then in most cases leave it equally. Now, when and how do you give it? Let's unpack this a little bit. So when and how? We'll talk about how in just a minute, but let's talk about when. And you see on your diagram there, you can leave assets to your children currently, or you can leave it in a deferred capacity. And deferred is through your will, it's through your estate plan. So we're talking about estate planning. And so this is the idea of you can either leave it when you die, that's deferred, or you can give them some currently. Now the laws are such that I think it's up to $17,000 per person now that you can give tax-free. So many folks will tell you as an estate planning technique, give your children as much as you can give them tax-free in what's called the annual exclusion. So you can give $34,000 and your spouse can give $34,000, and so you can start moving some assets to your children through the annual exclusion. That'd be a current gift, getting it out of your estate. But let me just make a principle, give you a principle here to think about. I would encourage you never to give them the same amount every year where they depend on it, and build it into their cash flow. Had a client many years ago, and back then it was $10,000 each, so they were getting 10 from mom, 10 from dad, and both husband and wife were getting it. It was $40,000 a year. They just built it into their cash flow. I would encourage you, if you're going to do current giving, and I think current giving is a great thing to do. I'll give you a story here in just a minute what I've done in my family. But I would just say make it different amounts. Don't just, even though the tax law, this is where sometimes tax laws aren't as good fiscal wisdom in trying to train your children. You want to bless them, you don't, I mean, here's the thing, when do your kids need it? They need it in 20 years, 30 years, or they need it now when they're starting their families and starting their careers? Well, answer is they probably need it now more than later. So I think there is a benefit for some current giving, so I would encourage you to do that. Just don't get it into just what the government says you can give tax-free. So let me tell you what I did. So a few years ago, my boys, I have 3 boys, they're in their 30s, so they've been tracking along, they're all married, and they all were driving cars that were a little bit on the really old age. And so I've been teaching this a lot over the years, and I thought, I can leave these assets in my estate and they'll get them when I die, or they could really use some cars now, all 3 of them. And so what I did one year is I made a larger gift that year, and this is the only time I've ever had a string attached. I told them I had veto power on the gift because I knew my one son would probably just give the money away and buy a junker. But they had to buy a car that would last at least 10 years, kind of get in this century and all that kind of stuff. And so, but it was a pretty large amount that I gave them that year. And I can honestly tell you it was so much fun to see them enjoy that, use it for the cars, and so I was able to do it while I was alive and enjoy it. So I kind of balanced that with just leaving it in my will. So I would just say to you, depending on your situation, there may be some current giving that would really benefit your children, your grandchildren, and so don't just think it's all through my estate. As you're thinking about your estate planning, think about some current giving that you could do too. Now, I told you about the larger number I gave them to buy a car. Well, the next year the number wasn't near that big. Fact is, I got tired of my boys always borrowing my stuff, my edger, my blower, things like this out of my barn. I'd go out to my barn, it was never there. So I thought, okay, we're gonna go to Ace Hardware, you're gonna buy your stuff so I get my stuff back. And I think it was like $1,392 or something was the number for that year. So that became the gift amount that year. The next year it was something different. Somebody needed a computer and that had a certain price point on it. But the point is, they can never know what they're gonna get. They'll just be blessed when they get it. And that's what you're trying to do. If it's within your ability on this current giving, you wanna bless your children, but don't let them depend on it and expect it. And that's why you mix up the amounts and just surprise them when they can use it. Like I said, they may have a young family or just getting started out or whatever. So do some current giving along with your deferred giving. And just the other thing I've done here, just as to be transparent, is in my old wills, I had the boys getting X amount and 10% going to charity. But my estate's not large enough to have any tax benefit of that charitable gift when I die, but I do get a charitable benefit now when I do current charitable giving while I'm alive. And so I changed my wills, took charity out of my documents because I wasn't getting any tax benefit, and told the boys I'm going to be way more aggressive on giving, your mom and I are going to be way more aggressive on giving to charity now while we're alive. And so that was a change in our will. Like I said, estate planning is a process. Maybe you're younger and you're changing guardians in your estate plan. So you maybe have changed out who's going to be there for your children, or maybe you've changed out trustee or whatever. So you need to keep looking at it, know what it says, and make appropriate updates as you go along. Like I said, that was an update I just made in the last couple of years because I realized I'm being a better steward by increasing my charitable giving currently, where I get a current income tax deduction rather than leaving it through my estate. So I basically told the boys, and we're going to start giving away some of your inheritance. That's what we did on that one. So now let's go down to the next decision. So how much to kids, how much to charity? You've answered that. It's probably going to be equal. when, give some currently, some through your estate, kind of blend those two together. That's a lot of fun. And then how do you give it? Well, here's the principle here. So I've shared several principles with you: 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60 on different amounts. I've shared the principle of don't give them the same amount every year if you're doing current giving. Well, the principle here is that the form of your assets should fit the skill of the recipient. What that means is you don't want to force your assets onto your children in a form that's going to frustrate them or not let them do what God has called and equipped them to do. You see the term capital conversion there. What this means is you have to look at your net worth and begin to say, hey, how's this going to flow through my estate? I've answered the question how much, which is great, but now how does it work when it ends up going down to my children? Like I said, I have 3 boys. One sells coffee, one is in the financial services industry, and one builds houses. So if I left my whole estate to them and all it was a financial planning practice, then one, that would be beneficial to him because that's the business he's in. The other two, it would frustrate them because they can't keep doing what they're doing. They need it in a different form. And so what you want to do is you want to look at your net worth and say, okay, what form is it in? And you want to begin to convert it so it works through your estate plan in a good fashion. 2 other words to write here is as you go through your estate planning, we all go through accumulation, preservation, and distribution. So depending on where you are in that sojourn, if you're in your 60s and 70s, you're getting closer and closer to distribution, you need to have 2 operative words: simplicity and liquidity. Begin to make it easy for that estate plan to work through your through your documents. It'll actually work. So here's a principle here. You want it to work so you don't end up with a lot of joint ownership amongst your heirs. So let's take, for example, I left the financial planning practice to my 3 boys, and only one of them really benefits from that. Well, the other 2 are going to either want to sell it, or they're going to want pieces, they want income off of it, or whatever. And so you don't want to you usually want to have 100% ownership of specific assets rather than 30%, or if you have 4 children, 25% of each. And so there's many unintended consequences if you leave an asset so it's split. Like, for example, in my parents' estate, I grew up on a farm in Kansas, and I have 4 siblings, and so we could either own 20% of different pieces of property or own 100% of one piece of property. And it's so much easier for each sibling to then do what God's called them to do if they own 100% of a piece of property rather than a fractional interest. So the principle here is you typically don't want a lot of joint ownership, and it even gets exacerbated as it goes on down to your grandchildren. So, because maybe I may own a third of it, but then I've got 3 children now, they own a 1/9 of it, and it gets way complicated. I was with a guy the other day, and we were talking about his lake house. And he says, well, my 2 boys get along. So the implication was I can leave my lake house to my 2 boys, and they'll do fine. Well, I can see a train wreck and a lot of unintended consequences because the boys have now gotten married. They're in their 30s. Their wives like to go to the beach. At least one of the wives like to go to the beach. And so I can see, if you play this out, right now the guy that owns the lake house, he's taken care of it for 40 years. He mows the grass, he makes sure it's fixed up when things are broken, gets a new roof, whatever. But now his 2 boys have it. Well, I don't ever go there, you go there. Why is he not mowing the grass? Oh, we got to do a roof. You need a capital call for X amount of money. Now, I'm not saying that there's not some legacy assets that you might have that you've got to figure out a way to keep them in the family. That may be the case. In that case, it may be an operating agreement or an LLC or something that spells it out, plus a sum of money to keep it up. But you can get in all kinds of potential challenges if you don't ask yourself what form of the asset needs to go to which child. I went and interviewed 2 daughters of a client, and the client was going to leave them their Montana property and their lake property. When we asked the 2 girls, they said, no, we don't even go to the Montana property if Dad's not here. And we're never going to go to the lake house, so we don't want that because one of them lives out of state and we never get to use it. And so this was a case where the form of the asset that the parents were going to leave was going to frustrate the recipients. And that's the punchline here, men and women, is you have a net worth that's got specific assets on it. You just want to ask yourself, where's the best place for this asset to go? I don't want to have a lot of joint ownership of an asset amongst my children because there's all kinds of unintended consequences there. And so how do I begin to make sure that I can get the assets in a form that fits their skills? A classic case is the business owner. Business owners have a unique challenge here because the majority of your net worth is probably in your business. And maybe only one child comes into the business. So he wants to keep capital in the business and grow the business. His siblings want money out of the business. And so you should do buy-sell agreements. That's why liquidity is important. That's why insurance is important, to help make sure you don't have these situations where your family is at odds or there's challenges over an asset. So that's why I would just encourage you, once you've done your wills, once you've answered the question how much, that now you take the specific assets and work them through and say, okay, is this the way I want it? Oh my word, I didn't want my child who's running the business, my son or daughter who's running the business, to have to, deal with their siblings on dividend policy or any number of things. So form fit skills, be willing to convert your capital, emphasize liquidity and simplicity as you go through your accumulation, preservation, distribution stage of your life. Now, once you've done all of those things, and answered all those questions, now you're ready to go techniques. Remember I said most people start with techniques because their attorneys assume you want to leave it all to your kids. Let's do discount family partnerships. Let's just make this really complicated. What I've experienced is that it gets simpler. It's simpler if you answer those other questions first. So usually your estate plan gets a lot simpler. You don't have some of the complications if you answer those 4 questions and then you do the techniques. So don't start with techniques. There's all kinds of great techniques. You see some of them listed there. But those come after you, and if you're married, your spouse have answered these questions. And then you're ready to do techniques. Don't start with techniques. Start with those other questions, and then you'll have, the techniques will get easier as you do that. So you're working through this process. Remember how we started. This is a way to think and a perspective on estate planning. Most people consider estate planning all the complicated techniques, and you may have to implement some of those. But you need to ask the right questions first. I mean, Warren Buffett answered the question, how much to his kids? Not a big number. Everything else to charity, not a lot of estate tax, not a lot of complications, because he answered the questions in the first box first. All right, now once you've answered all these, you get down to question 6, and that's have a family conference. Let me give you a phrase, and I'll repeat it twice because I want you to write it down. To the degree there's wealth, if there's not intentional communication about the wealth, it's tantamount to withholding affection. To the degree you have wealth, if there's not intentional communication about the wealth, it's tantamount to withholding affection. And I'd venture to say all of you watching this and listening would not withhold affection from your children. You love your children. And so what that means is you need to talk about this. You need to help them understand the answers to these questions and why you've done what you've done and what the values are that you want to pass on. You see a little diagram there, expectations and reality. If you don't have an intentional communication plan, your children may have expectations that don't match up with reality. And that's what causes this coping gap and causes some of the frustrations. They just didn't know. So you need to get out ahead of that. Why did you leave the number you left? Why do you have charity included in your document? You begin to explain why you might use a foundation, why you might have named charity. Help the children understand that you're doing that to avoid estate tax, whatever. And people will say to me, well, Russ, when do I talk to my kids? How do I even go about this? And you see, why do you have the meeting? It's intentional communication. When? Usually after they're over 18 years old, they need to be included in this meeting. What do you talk about? Who comes? Where do you have it? Let me just unpack a few of those. This is kind of a formal business meeting. Now let me say one other thing about this and write this one down. This meeting is not optional. People say, well, I don't know. There's gonna be a family meeting. It's just whether or not it's around the coffee table or around the coffin. It's whether you're going to be there or not. There is going to be a meeting. And I would propose to you that your children should not be surprised about anything that the attorneys talk about after you go to be with Jesus. You should have already gotten out ahead of that, helped them understand. Fact is, I'll show you this right here is a summary, and I'll hold it up here where you can see it. I don't know if you can really see it here, but this is the agenda or the table of contents for the family meeting that I had with my family in the last 18 months. It has our net worth, it has our mission statement, it has our values, it has an estate diagram, has our wills, financial power of attorney, healthcare directive. And so the point is, we've taken and formalized the communication in a notebook. So all my boys and their spouses now have a notebook that has all this information in it. It has the net worth. You say, well, I can't tell my kids what I'm worth. Well, so let's talk about this a minute. When they're younger, you can start off just with principles. What is a foundation? Why would you include charity? What are basic financial planning principles? Begin to educate them and why it's important to you as a steward to have these meetings. Then as your children get older, they're going to start guessing stuff. They know where you live. They know what kind of cars you drive. They know what kind of business you have. And so at some point, if you don't give them reality, they're going to begin to expect things or have, I remember I met with a client and I asked the son, I said, well, how much did your dad make? He says, well, I think he makes $200,000. Well, no, I talked to my brother, he makes $2 million. And so they were beginning to piece it together. Sometimes we'll take these documents and give them to our kids and say, hey, sign this, don't ask any questions. The point is, you need to drive the narrative. And you need to help them at some point begin to understand stewardship, understand values, understand what you're trying to accomplish. Because remember, some people say, well, I can't have this meeting. Well, they're going to find out. It's just in the attorney's office after you're gone. And so at the right time, you begin to train them, educate them, help them understand the principles, and then at some point, you overlay the numbers. I'm not saying you walk in when they're 16, 18 years old and show them all your numbers. You start with the principles. But then eventually you need to help them realize, hey, here's what we have. Your mom and I have this house. We have this business. It's worth this. God's blessed us. You also in this family meeting want to help them see what God's done in your life and what's happened financially. You want to see the journey because you didn't just get where you got overnight. So it's good for your children to understand. When Julie and I did our meeting a year and a half ago, I explained to them our 40-year spiritual history and our 40-year financial history, what God had done. Because your children need to understand where God has intercepted you and how he's blessed you to get where you've gotten. I remember doing a family meeting in Florida, and one of the grandchildren came up to the patriarch and said, Granddad, I'm glad you shared all this with us. He had a really successful business. We didn't think you ever worked. And so this family meeting is so important. And it kind of depends on, and so the way these happen is you sit down and you get some advice about where should you start. Should you start with principles? Should you start with techniques? What do you start with? And that's where a third party is important. Like I said, I've done 3 of these for my family, but after the last meeting, I said I'm hiring a Ron Blue Trust advisor to conduct the next meeting. It's just important to have that third party to help facilitate this intentional communication. So have it after they're 18. Whatever the content is will be determined by your unique situation and the age of your children and kind of where they are in their spiritual journey and where you are. But I'm just saying, don't be afraid of having this meeting, and remember it's going to be, see, people will say to me, well, I can't have that meeting. And then what they've forgotten is this is not optional. It's going to happen. It's just you getting out ahead of it. And the scripture says, to him who much has been given, much is required. This is where the more you have, the more frequently you might have to have these meetings. As your business changes, as your net worth changes, as your children change, as the grandchildren come along. So there'll be all these precipitating events as to what would dictate having another meeting. I've had 3 meetings. One of the meetings was facilitated by a melanoma scare. I think I was going to be there in 6 months. So that was the impetus to having a meeting. So maybe you've decided to add charity, or maybe you're selling the business, or you fill in the blank. There may be a precipitating event that would say we need to have another meeting. But it is a process, and the more you have, the more these meetings need to be more intentional as you go along. So I hope what you've heard is, in this short time we've had together, is don't start with techniques. Answer how much to kids and how much to charity. That's the first thing. Usually it's going to be left equal. And let me just say something about that. Usually you don't leave it all outright, and usually what people do is leave 25, leave maybe a third when they're 25, a third when they're 30, a third when they're 35. I would not have trusts that are into the 40s, 45, 50-year-old age, because then your kids just wait for that trust to come. That you need to get it to them sooner than later. That's where this current giving may fit in. Then begin to look at your net worth and get the form of the assets to make sure they work through your estate plan and don't have unintended consequences. And then you go to your attorney, have him make sure those documents line up with your answers to these questions. and then you have a family meeting. Let me say one other thing about the family meeting. There's another document that you might want to make a note of, and that's called the homegoing process. Back in 2009, my middle son was getting married in our backyard at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and at 5 o'clock the day before, my younger brother died of a heart attack. So in the course of a weekend, I was marrying a son and burying my brother. But what happened was, as we went to the funeral home that Friday afternoon before the wedding, and they started asking us questions, they started asking us a bunch of questions. How many obituaries do you want? And what newspapers do those go in? And how many death certificates do you want? And there were a whole lot of things that they asked us that we didn't have answers to. And I know if you go to the funeral home, they'll have primarily a financial document that you'll fill out. They don't have some of these soft side things. Who are the pallbearers? What kind of music do you want sung? So what we did is we created what's called the homegoing process. It's a document where you fill out all this soft side stuff. Your children will be so glad that it's stuck there with your wills, because it'll answer the questions. Oh, that's what mom and dad wanted. That's what they wanted for the music and who the pastor is and all that. So anyway, feel free, as I said, to reach out to ronblue.com and ask for that homegoing process if you'd like to receive a copy of that. But this is an important document to kind of be intentional in your communication. So as we kind of wrap up here, you're gonna do it, because they're gonna do a poll here. If you want to speak to an advisor, just hit yes if you'd like to speak to an advisor. Somebody will reach out to you, or no. So feel free to go on and do that on the poll. We'd appreciate you doing that. And then I think we're going to go to the chat. First question, very good. Advice for single person, never married, no children, who are heirs. Here's where I would look around. Maybe you have some nieces, nephews, other family members that you would like to bless with your estate. So you could give that to them. You may want to include some special charities you have. So I think this is a chance for you to ask all those questions. So that's a good question. But yeah, just know that you should still have a will that answers those questions as who you're going to give to. How do you best go about deciding what your legacy should be? Well, let me talk about legacy. It's interesting. Everybody uses that word, and we all have a legacy, right? And so basically, let me give you another word, heritage. We're all building and investing in heritage as we go along. So for example, in my family, I have a heritage of learning a good work ethic. That was a positive heritage. I had a negative heritage in how not to treat your spouse. So we're modeling for our children and grandchildren positive or negative heritage aspects. Do they love Jesus? Do they have a work ethic? Do they have a meaningful purpose? These are all positive things. And so the minute you die, your heritage becomes your legacy. So you're building your legacy while you're alive. So when you say, how do I build a legacy? I think the important thing is to realize that you're building it starting right now. Every day, whatever you're communicating as important to your children and grandchildren, that's your heritage. But the minute you die, you can't change that. So for example, are you communicating a legacy of generosity? Are you being generous now? Is that part of your heritage? Or are your children and grandchildren picking up on your generosity? And so that's what you want to leave with them. Are they picking up the work ethic? Are they picking up, meaningful purpose? Are they picking up how to live with your spouse in an understanding way? Those kind of things. And so I think what I've observed is people want to have a legacy, but they don't realize that they will have one. We all have a legacy. The scriptures talk about a posterity. At the posterity, the wicked will be cut off, and the posterity, the righteous, will be remembered. And so every day as you're living your life and making decisions, that will become your legacy. So what I would encourage you to do is think about, what do I want them to pick up? And we've heard it said, it's trite, but it's absolutely true, is more is caught than taught. And so you can, so for example, if you're dealing with your estate plan, you're dealing with your family meeting, and you're being intentional because it's important to you, you're talking to your children about it, they're going to catch that this is important. And they're going to catch the stewardship mindset. I grew up in a family, part of my legacy and heritage that I picked up was not being generous. But over the years, I've learned how to be more generous by God's grace, and it's been neat to watch my boys pick that up. As a matter of fact, one of my sons has a giving car that he just holds it with an open hand, and it's there to minister to people that need transportation, or maybe a missionary that's back and needs a car or whatever. And of course, I'm worried about, liability and all this stuff, but it's just been neat to see him have that generous spirit, and he picked that up. And so more's caught than taught, and just that's how your legacy is being built as you go along. Can you repeat? To the degree there's wealth, if there's not intentional communication about the wealth, it's tantamount to withholding affection. To the degree there's wealth, if there's not intentional communication about the wealth, it's tantamount to withholding affection. So hopefully you've got that written down. If you didn't get it, send us an email or jump on and we can get that to you. You suggested to give the same to all children. What if an adult child is not making reasonable choices, selfish, volatile, angry, and other children's lives are on a track? Okay. Okay, thank you for asking this, Jill. This is what we run into all the time. You would think the tendency would be to leave more to the two or the ones that aren't, the ones that are tracking. But here again, that's where it gets really challenging, because you got to put yourself in the shoes of the child who's right now not making reasonable choices, and they're sitting around the table and they've kind of been left out, or they get a different amount. I'm not sure that's what you want to say. Fact is, I've seen parents who have made decisions to give it to the ones that they thought were tracking, and the one that wasn't tracking didn't get as much, and then they should have done it the other way around, because someone that were tracking got off base, and the one that wasn't tracking got on base. So, yeah, you'd have to talk through each of the specifics, but here again, very careful. Now, if sometimes it can be put in trust, it's still equal, but it may be in trust to protect them from themselves. Let's say they've got some spending problems, or they may self-destruct. I mean, it'd still be equal, but you may put a like-minded, common valued trustee in place to have some checks there. That would be a potential step. Now, what I've done with several clients, if I put it in trust for the one that's not making reasonable choices, I put it in trust for all of them. That way, here again, they're all being treated the same. And so, this happens many times. One child's not tracking, but the jury's still out, and that's what I've observed. I can't tell you how many times in 40 years, the one that they thought was tracking ends up getting off base. The ones that they didn't think were tracking came around. And I think you just need to love them, and in most cases, treat them equally. We have 2 bio kids and 5 adopted. They were older and have lots of challenges. Wow. So sorry you have all these issues. I think here again, this is maybe where you have to deal with some trust that are there to support them for basic health support and maintenance needs, things like that. But it's just like I said, I gave you principles in general, and they generally work, even though every family has unique situations. And so what I can think about here is just, and here's why even in this situation, 2 living on the streets, is having a family meeting where you're sharing your heart, and you're sharing your history, and you're sharing your desire to steward well what God's entrusted you. I just can't overemphasize how important that is going to be, depending on the size of your estate and things like that, that you're really trying to include everybody, at least in this communication, and why. And I think sometimes that helps. I've seen many times when there's a child not tracking, when you begin to bring everybody together and talk about your stewardship responsibility. Remember I said share your story, share your financial story, your spiritual story. Those are important. We won't be able to get most of them together for a family meeting. Can't even find one. That's a tough one. Back to one thing I would say, I didn't say this about the family meetings, is these are usually, you invite them, it's kind of, they get a letter, you're being invited to a meeting. It's usually not held in your home. It's usually not held at the end of a vacation. It's usually held as it's kind of a formal business meeting in a boardroom at a hotel or something like that. And so even if you live in different parts of the country, and you would pay for them to get there. You would cover the cost, because this is an important communication time for your children. So I would just encourage you that hopefully we've shared something that's a little different than what you've had before. I would just go on the screen, and like I said, go to ronblue.com and if you want an advisor to call you, go to the button and hit yes, and we'd be happy to reach out to you. If you'd like the homegoing process document, let us know and we can get that to you. But hopefully this is a different perspective. The techniques take care of themselves, whether you add a foundation. And let me just say one other thing. I didn't say this while I was talking about the charitable bequest in your documents. Many times we see folks use what's called a donor advised fund, because that way you don't have to change your will every time you change the ultimate beneficiaries. You can just have a sheet on file with the donor advised fund. Use a Christian donor advised fund in your documents as a recipient if you add charity to your wills. Versus, the reason for that is it just makes it simpler than just, if you say your church and then you change churches, you got to go change your will, or if you decide to do a different ministry. So I should have said that early on, but if you add charity to your documents, usually we like to see a donor advised fund used, and it makes it simpler. Remember I said two operative words: simple and liquidity. So thank you so very much for spending the afternoon with us. I hope something piqued your interest, or maybe it was a little different perspective in how to look at your estate plan, and you'll have something to go talk to your attorneys about. So thank you very much. Reach out to us if we can be of help.